They found the first body on a Tuesday morning in March 1839, face down in the Savannah River with stones tied to his ankles and a single word carved into the skin of his back. The word was forgiveness. Within 18 months, 3 more men from Georgia's wealthiest plantation families would die under circumstances so disturbing that the governor himself ordered the investigation sealed. What connected these deaths wasn't immediately obvious to authorities. Different methods, different locations, months apart. But if you looked closely at the records, if you traced the movement of property between estates, if you listened to the whispers among the enslaved communities along the river, one name appeared again and again, not in official documents, not in newspaper accounts, but in the careful warnings passed between house servants and field workers, spoken only in darkness when white ears couldn't hear. Her name was Delilah, and she understood something that terrified every man who learned her secret. That the greatest weapon against power isn't violence or rebellion, it's desire. And she had learned to wield that weapon with surgical precision. Before you hear how one woman brought Georgia's most powerful families to their knees, I need you to understand something about the world she operated in. These weren't random acts of revenge. This was warfare conducted in bedrooms and parlors, in whispered promises and stolen moments, in the dangerous space between what men wanted and what society allowed them to have. What Delilah discovered was that the same system designed to control her body had also created men who were prisoners of their own appetites, and she would use that prison to destroy them all. The Ogeechee River district of eastern Georgia had built its fortune on rice cultivation and cotton, with a handful of families controlling nearly everything that mattered. Politics, commerce, social standing, all of it flowed through the drawing rooms and dinner tables of 5 or 6 plantation houses where decisions were made over brandy and cigars. In 1837, the most powerful of these families was the Merrick household. Jonathan Merrick owned Belle Haven, 4,000 acres of prime bottomland worked by over 200 enslaved people. He was 41 years old, Yale-educated, served in the state senate, and was being mentioned as a possible candidate for governor. His wife, Eleanor, came from Charleston's Rutland family, bringing connections that extended throughout the South. They had 3 sons, the eldest already at university, and a daughter, named Caroline, who was considered the most eligible young woman in the county. Everything about the Merrick family suggested permanence and power, the kind of dynasty that would shape Georgia for generations. 6 miles downriver stood Riverside, the estate of Thomas and Abigail Thornton. Thomas was 38, more businessman than planter, with investments in railroads and textile mills. His wealth was newer than Merrick's, his family less distinguished, but his practical intelligence had made him indispensable to the district's economy. The Thornton had 2 children, and ambitions of joining the Merrick social circle through careful cultivation of friendship and strategic marriage proposals. The third family, the Whitfields at Oakmont, represented old money and older attitudes. Henry Whitfield was 56, a widower, traditional in his views and rigid in his expectations. His 2 sons managed different aspects of the plantation operations, while he maintained absolute control over family decisions. The 4th estate belonged to the Beaumont family, merchants who'd transitioned to planting. Richard Beaumont was 32, charming, educated in Europe, and carrying secrets that would have destroyed his reputation if they'd ever become public. Into this carefully balanced world of power and propriety, Delilah arrived in the summer of 1837 as part of an estate settlement. She was listed in the documents as approximately 22 years old, described with unusual specificity. Quadron appearance, exceptionally handsome features, trained in household service, literate, though this was not advertised, and possessed of what the auctioneer carefully termed a refined manner and uncommon grace. The listing also noted something else, that she was being sold by court order from a Savannah estate, and that the sale included a requirement she be taken at least 50 miles from the city. This should have been a warning. When property comes with distance requirements, there's usually a reason, but Jonathan Merrick, who purchased her for $800 to work in his wife's household, didn't ask the right questions. He saw an opportunity to acquire someone who would enhance his wife's social standing, Elena needed help managing the increasingly complex social obligations that came with her husband's political rise. A house servant who could read, write, manage correspondence, and present well would be invaluable. Delilah arrived at Belhaven in late June 1837. Eleanor approved immediately. The woman carried herself with unusual composure, spoke with appropriate difference, and demonstrated competence in everything from needlework to French. She was assigned to work directly with Eleanor on household management and social correspondence. For the first months, everything proceeded exactly as expected. Delilah was efficient, discreet, and remarkably skilled at understanding what was needed before being asked. The other house serve. Aunts accepted her presence. The family came to rely on her judgment. By autumn, she'd become indispensable. What nobody in the Merrick household understood was that Delilah had spent those months doing something else entirely. She'd been studying them, not their habits or preferences, but their hungers, the things they wanted but couldn't acknowledge, the desires they kept hidden even from themselves. She watched how Jonathan's eyes followed certain women at social gatherings. She noticed how he touched his wife less frequently as his political obligations increased. She observed the tension in Eleanor's shoulders when her husband praised other men's wives. She saw how their eldest son, Edward, home from university, looked at her when he thought no one noticed. Most importantly, she recognized something the Merrick family had spent years pretending didn't exist. That Jonathan Merrick, for all his power and respectability, was desperately lonely in his marriage. That Eleanor had learned to perform affection without feeling it, and that their carefully maintained public image concealed a household where real intimacy had died years ago. This was the weakness Delilah had been searching for, not financial vulnerability or social insecurity, but something deeper, the gap between what powerful men presented to the world and what they actually felt in the darkness. She'd seen this pattern before in Savannah, in the household where she'd learned her methods, and she knew exactly how to exploit it. The seduction of Jonathan Merrick began not with physical contact but with understanding. In December 1837, after a particularly frustrating day dealing with legislative opponents, Jonathan sat in his study reviewing correspondence. Delilah entered to bring coffee, and as she sat down the tray, she spoke quietly. "You carry too much weight alone, sir. Any man would break under such burdens." Jonathan looked up surprised. It was an inappropriate comment from a servant crossing boundaries that were supposed to remain absolute, but something in her voice, a note of genuine concern rather than flattery, made him respond. "The responsibilities of office require sacrifices." She met his eyes for just a moment. "Sacrifices you make, and sacrifices you require of yourself that others don't see." She left before he could respond, but the seed was planted. Over the following weeks, Delilah created opportunities for brief exchanges, never forward, never inappropriate by any standard that could be articulated, but building a sense of recognition between them. She seemed to understand pressures he couldn't discuss with his wife or colleagues. She offered observations that suggested she saw him not as the public figure everyone else saw, but as a man with genuine feelings and struggles. By February 1838, Jonathan found himself thinking about Delilah more than he knew he should. He began creating reasons to speak with her privately, small household matters that didn't require his attention, but gave him opportunity to be in her presence. He told himself he was simply appreciating competent service. He didn't acknowledge the truth that he was lonely, that his marriage had become a performance, and that this woman offered something he hadn't felt in years. The feeling of being truly seen. What happened next took place over a single weekend in late February, when Eleanor traveled to Charleston to visit her sister. The house was quieter, with fewer social obligations. On Saturday evening, Jonathan sat in the library reviewing papers. Delilah brought brandy without being asked. As she turned to leave, he spoke. "Stay a moment if you would." She stopped but didn't turn fully. "Sir, I wanted to thank you for your service to this household. You've been invaluable to my wife." He paused, and to me she turned then, meeting his gaze. "I serve as I'm able, sir, but I think perhaps you mistake gratitude for something else." "What do you mean?" "Men in your position," she said carefully, often feel gratitude toward people who see them clearly, who understand what they truly need rather than what they're supposed to want. It's a dangerous feeling, because society provides no acceptable way to express it. The conversation that followed lasted nearly an hour. They didn't touch. They barely moved from their positions across the room, but what happened was more intimate than physical contact. Jonathan found himself speaking about things he'd never voiced to anyone. His disappointment in his marriage, his doubts about his political ambitions, his fear that he'd built a life that looked impressive from outside but felt hollow within. Delilah listened, with focus that felt almost sacred, and when she responded, it was with understanding that seemed to reach into his chest and recognize things he'd barely admitted to himself. By the time Ella Lenina returned from Charleston, something had changed fundamentally in the Merrick household. Jonathan had fallen into emotional dependence on someone he legally owned, and Delilah had gained the leverage she'd been carefully cultivating, but she hadn't seduced him yet. Not physically, that would come later, at precisely the moment when his resistance was lowest and the consequences would be most devastating. The physical affair began on March 17, 1838, in the small room behind the library where estate records were kept. Jonathan had convinced himself he was simply reviewing inventory documents. Delilah had convinced herself of nothing. She knew exactly what she was doing and why. What happened between them that afternoon wasn't passionate or romantic. It was transactional in ways Jonathan didn't yet understand. He thought he was finally expressing feelings he'd suppressed for months. She knew she was taking the first step in destroying everything he'd built. Afterward, as he sat with his head in his hands, consumed by guilt and fear, she spoke with a calmness that should have terrified him. "This doesn't have to destroy you," she said quietly, "unless you allow it to." He looked at her desperately. "What we did. If anyone discovered it, I would be ruined. My career, my family, everything." She nodded. "Yes, you would be, which is why no one will discover it unless you make me your enemy." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Jonathan had just handed absolute power to someone who'd been legally powerless, and in that moment their relationship transformed. He was no longer the master and she the slave. He was now the prisoner of his own desire and guilt, and she held the keys to his cage. Over the following weeks, the affair continued with careful discretion. They met in the records room, in the carriage house during evening hours, once in the summer kitchen when the rest of the household slept. Jonathan told himself he couldn't stop, that his feelings were too strong. The truth was simpler and more shameful. He continued because she allowed him to, and he was terrified of what would happen if she chose to end their arrangement on her terms rather than his. Delilah used this time to extract information. She learned about Merrick's business dealings, his political vulnerabilities, his private opinions of other prominent families. She discovered which men owed him favors and which held grudges. She mapped the entire power structure of the district through pillow talk and careful questioning that seemed like natural curiosity rather than intelligence gathering. Most significantly, she learned about Thomas Thornton. Jonathan harbored deep resentment toward the younger man, whose practical success made Merrick's political accomplishments seem decorative by comparison. He'd opposed Thornton's railroad investments publicly, while secretly attempting to manipulate the ventures for his own benefit. This information was exactly what Delilah needed, because Thomas Thornton would be her next target, and she'd need leverage to position herself in his household. The opportunity came in late April when Elana mentioned during a social gathering that the Thorntons were seeking a more accomplished house servant. Their current staff was adequate for daily management, but lacked sophistication for the increasingly important social events Abigail was hosting. Eleanor, in a moment of calculated generosity that was really about displaying her own taste and connections, suggested the Thorntons might borrow Delilah for their upcoming dinner party. Jonathan objected privately, but Eleanor was insistent. Lending a servant of Delilah's quality would demonstrate the Merrick family's superior position and generosity. Delilah spent 3 days at Riverside in early May, ostensibly helping prepare for the Thorntons' dinner. In reality, she was conducting reconnaissance. Thomas Thornton was 38, ambitious and carrying his own secret hungers. Abigail was distant in ways that mirrored Eleanor's coldness, but for different reasons. where Eleanor's distance came from aristocratic conditioning. Abigail's came from disappointment. She'd married Thomas, believing his commercial success would translate into social elevation. Instead, she found herself constantly working to compensate for her husband's lack of family connections. The Thornton marriage was a business partnership where both parties felt cheated. Thomas wanted a wife who admired him rather than constantly pushing for more. Abigail wanted a husband who could provide social standing without her constant management. Into this mutual disappointment, Delilah observed and learned from Jonathan Merrick. Merrick had wanted to be seen and understood. Thornton wanted to be admired without conditions, to feel successful rather than constantly striving. After the dinner party concluded successfully, Abigail Thornton mentioned to Eleanor how impressive Delilah had been, how the evening had gone more smoothly than any previous event, how having someone of such competence would transform their social standing. Eleanor, playing her role perfectly, suggested an arrangement. The Mer could loan Delilah to the Thorntons for an extended period, perhaps 6 months, in exchange for certain business considerations Jonathan was seeking from Thomas. The arrangement was proposed as a favor between families. In reality, it was exactly what Delilah had been engineering. She demonstrated value to the Thorntons while making her presence at Belhaven increasingly complicated for Jonathan, who was both addicted to their affair and terrified of discovery. The arrangement suited everyone's immediate interests, even as it advanced Delilah's larger plan. She arrived at Riverside in June 1838, and this time her strategy was different. Thomas Thornton wasn't lonely or introspective like Merrick. He was vain and insecure, constantly seeking validation of his worth. Delilah became his mirror, reflecting back an image of himself he desperately wanted to believe was real. She praised his business judgment when Abigail questioned it. She expressed admiration for accomplishments Abigail took for granted. She created moments where Thomas felt like the impressive, successful man he believed he deserved to be seen as. The seduction came faster than it had with Merrick. By July, Thomas was seeking private conversations. By August, he was touching her in ways that crossed boundaries he knew he shouldn't cross. And by September, they were meeting in the office where he managed his commercial correspondence, always late at night when Abigail and the household slept. But Delilah's game with Thornton was more sophisticated than what she'd played with Merrick. She wasn't just gathering information or securing leverage. She was creating a triangle of mutual destruction, because Jonathan Merrick back at Belhaven was becoming increasingly unstable without her presence. He wrote letters he shouldn't have written, made visits to Riverside on flimsy pretexts, drank more heavily and became careless in ways that drew Eleanor's suspicion. Eleanor didn't know about the affair, not yet, but she recognized her husband's distraction and correctly identified its timing with Delilah's absence. Meanwhile, Delilah was feeding carefully selected information to Thomas Thornton about Merrick's business dealings. True information, verifiable facts, but presented in ways that highlighted Merrick's attempts to undermine Thornton's commercial ventures. She positioned herself as someone who felt obligated to warn him because she'd observed so much during her time at Belhaven. The information she provided was devastating because it was accurate. Merrick had indeed attempted to sabotage Thornton's railroad investments. He'd spread rumors about Thornton's financial stability to European investors. He'd used his political connections to create regulatory obstacles. Thomas's rage upon learning this was profound. The man he'd considered a respected colleague had been systematically working to destroy him. In October 1838, Thomas confronted Jonathan publicly at a Planters Association meeting. The confrontation was brutal. Two prominent men descending into open warfare, trading accusations that revealed far more about both their characters than either intended. The scandal consumed the district's attention for weeks, and while everyone watched the Merrick-Thornton conflict unfold, Delilah had already begun working on her third target. Because Henry Whitfield's eldest son, Marcus, had been visiting Riverside frequently on business matters, and Marcus Whitfield had noticed the woman who seemed to understand so much about the district's power dynamics, who carried herself with unusual intelligence, who seemed to see through the pretenses that governed everyone else's interactions. Marcus was 34, unmarried, and carrying his own secret that would destroy his family if revealed. He preferred the company of men in ways that society considered criminal. He'd managed to conceal this through careful performance and strategic friendship with women who helped maintain his cover. When he met Delilah, he recognized immediately that she knew, not through anything obvious, but through the way she spoke with him, without the performative charm she used with other men, with directness that suggested she understood he didn't want what other men wanted from her. Over several conversations in November they reached an unspoken agreement. She wouldn't expose what he was, and he would provide her with information about his father's household and business dealings. It was alliance rather than seduction, but it served Delilah's purposes equally well. Through Marcus she learned about the Whitfield family's complex financial situation, about old debts and older grudges, about vulnerabilities that weren't visible from outside. By December 1838, Delilah had 3 of Georgia's most powerful families in her web. Merrick compromised by their affair and increasingly unstable. Thornton compromised by their affair and company, consumed by rage at Merrick, and Marcus Whitfield providing intelligence about his own family's weaknesses. The stage was set for the destruction to begin in earnest. But what none of these men understood yet was that Delilah wasn't interested in blackmail or financial gain. Her goals were far more radical than simple revenge or profit. She wanted to prove something that the entire system of slavery depended on denying, that an enslaved woman could be smarter, more strategic, and more powerful than the men who claimed to own her, that the very desires they used to control women's bodies could be turned into weapons that would destroy them completely. If you're wondering how one woman could orchestrate such complex manipulation across multiple families, you need to understand something that white society consistently underestimated. The enslaved communities maintained networks of information that moved faster and more accurately than anything white people had access to. Every servant who traveled between plantations carried news. Every field hand who delivered goods to town heard gossip. Every house servant who served at dinner parties gathered intelligence that would never have been shared if white families had acknowledged that enslaved people were listening, understanding, and remembering everything. Delilah had spent years building relationships within these networks. She knew which servants could be trusted, which harbored their own grievances, which wanted to see the power full families brought low. She cultivated sources at every estate in town businesses, even in the courthouse where she'd befriended the enslaved man who cleaned the offices and had access to legal documents. This network gave her information that seemed impossible for a house servant to possess. But it wasn't magic or supernatural ability. It was simply the accumulated intelligence of hundreds of people who'd learned to move invisibly through white spaces while watching everything and forgetting nothing. The first death happened on March 12, 1839. Thomas Thornton's body was found in the Savannah River, with stones tied to his ankles and the word forgiveness carved into his back. The discovery sent shockwaves through the district. Thornton had been missing for 3 days before a fisherman spotted the body caught in tree roots near the shore. Sheriff William Dye investigated immediately. The wound suggested Thornton had been killed elsewhere, then transported to the river. The stones indicated premeditation. The carved words suggested religious or philosophical motivation that made no sense in context of a robbery or simple murder. Most disturbing was the physical evidence. Thornton had been tortured before death, burns on his chest and arms, fingers broken methodically, marks suggesting he'd been restrained and subjected to prolonged suffering. Whatever had happened to him hadn't been quick or merciful. Daisy interviewed everyone who'd seen Thornton in his final days. The plan. Tare had been agitated, drinking heavily, making comments about betrayal and justice. His last confirmed sighting was leaving a waterfront tavern in Savannah on the evening of March 9th. What the investigation didn't uncover immediately was that Delilah had been in Savannah that same week. She'd been sent by Abigail to purchase specific items for the household, a trip that would normally take 2 days, but it stretched to 5. She returned to Riverside on March 11th, the day before Thornton's body was discovered. When Abigail asked about the delay, Delilah explained there had been difficulties finding the specific fabrics requested, requiring visits to multiple merchants. Abigail accepted this explanation. She had no reason to suspect that her husband's murder had any connection to her house servant. The funeral was massive, attended by everyone of importance in the district. Jonathan Merrick delivered a eulogy praising Thornton's business acumen, while privately feeling relief that his enemy was gone. Abigail Thornton performed grief appropriately, while calculating how she would manage the estate alone, and Delilah watched it all with the same calm efficiency she brought to every task, her face showing appropriate sorrow while inside she felt only cold satisfaction. 1 down, 3 to go. The investigation into Thomas Thornton's murder consumed Sheriff Dye for months. He interviewed over 60 people, examined financial records, pursued theories about business rivals and disgruntled associates. What he couldn't find was motive that explained the torture and the carved word forgiveness. If this was revenge, who was forgiving whom? If this was a message, who was meant to receive it? The answer would have required Daisy to understand something about Delilah's philosophy that no white man in Georgia was prepared to comprehend, that she saw herself as an instrument of divine justice, that the men she destroyed weren't random targets but specific sinners who embodied everything evil about the system that enslaved her, and that the word carved into Thornton's flesh wasn't asking for forgiveness, it was offering it. Because in Delilah's twisted theology she was liberating these men from their sins through death. She was forgiving them for what they'd done to her and to countless others. And then she was sending them to face whatever judgment awaited beyond this world. While Daisy searched for a killer who matched none of his assumptions, Delilah had already begun the final phase of Jonathan Merrick's destruction. She returned to Belhaven in April 1839. Her loan period to the Thorntons concluded by Thornton's death, and Abigail's need to manage estate affairs personally. Eleanor welcomed her back, noting her husband's improved mood upon Delilah's return. What Eleanor didn't see was the desperation in Jonathan's eyes when he looked at Delilah, or the way his hands shook when they spoke. Privately, Jonathan had spent months consumed by obsession. He'd written letters he'd never sent. He'd made late-night visits to Riverside that had nearly exposed their affair. He'd become dependent on her presence in ways that terrified him, even as he couldn't stop himself. When Delilah returned, he was like an addict, finally getting what he'd been craving, and she knew she had him completely. Their first private conversation took place in the records room where their affair had begun. Jonathan grabbed her immediately, desperately, but she stepped back. "We need to talk first about what happens next." He was breathing hard, confused. "What do you mean?" "I mean that Thomas Thornton is dead and people are asking questions about who benefited from his death. Your name comes up frequently in those conversations." Jonathan went pale. "That's insane. I had nothing to do with it." She met his eyes steadily. "I know you didn't, but the problem is that people know about your conflict with him. They know you hated him. And if anyone discovered certain other connections involving me, the questions would become much more dangerous." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that I visited Savannah the week Thornton died, and if investigators learned that, and if they learned about our relationship, they might conclude, you sent me to kill him. That's ridiculous. No one would believe a slave could commit such a murder." Delilah smiled without warmth. "You'd be surprised what people believe when evidence points them in a particular direction, especially evidence like letters you've written. Letters describing your feelings for me and your hatred of Thornton." Jonathan's voice cracked. "What letters? I never sent anything." She pulled folded papers from inside her dress. "You wrote them, though. I found them in your desk. You never sent them because you knew how dangerous they were, but I kept them because I knew they might be useful someday." The betrayal hit Jonathan like a physical blow. "You're blackmailing me." She shook her head. "I'm protecting both of us as long as we're careful. As long as you help me with certain matters, these letters stay hidden. But if you become my enemy, if you try to send me away or harm me, then circumstances might force me to reveal things neither of us once revealed." Over the following weeks, Jonathan Merrick discovered what it meant to be truly trapped. He couldn't expose Delilah without exposing himself. He couldn't send her away without raising questions about why, and he couldn't stop seeing her because she controlled whether he faced murder accusations. He'd become a prisoner in his own home, controlled by someone who was legally his property. The psychological torture was exquisite. She would arrange their meetings at times he couldn't refuse, then would ask about his political activities, his business dealings, his private thoughts about other F. She learned about corruption in the state legislature, about illegal land deals, about bribes he'd accepted and favors he'd traded. And she stored all of it away for future use. By June 1839, Jonathan was falling apart. He drank heavily, his hands trembled, his political speeches became rambling and unfocused. Eleanor finally confronted him about his health. His response was to confess everything, not about the murder suspicions or the blackmail, but about the affair. He told Eleanor he'd been intimate with Delilah, that he'd betrayed their marriage, that he was consumed with guilt and needed her forgiveness. Eleanor's reaction wasn't what he expected. She didn't rage or weep. Instead, she went very still and quiet. Her voice when she spoke was ice. "You've destroyed this family, everything we've built, our reputation, your career, our children's futures, all of it sacrificed because you couldn't control yourself with a slave." She left the room and locked herself in her chambers. For 3 days, she refused to see anyone. The household held its breath, waiting to see what would happen. What happened was that Eleanor made a decision. She would not allow her husband's weakness to destroy her family. She called for Delilah and dismissed all other servants from the room. The conversation between Eleanor and Delilah was witnessed by no one, but its consequences would become clear very quickly. Eleanor emerged from that meeting with a plan. Delilah would be sold immediately to a traitor heading for the deeper south. All evidence of her time at Belhaven would be removed from household records. Jonathan would submit to treat me, NT for his drinking and nervous condition. The family would present a unified front, suggesting Jonathan's political opponents had spread malicious rumors about his relationship with a servant, but that Eleanor stood by her husband completely. It was damage control, ruthless and practical, and it might have worked if Delilah hadn't been 3 moves ahead, because while Eleanor thought she was protecting her family, she just made herself complicit in something that would haunt her forever. The trader who purchased Delilah was named Josiah Puit, a rough man who moved enslaved people along southern routes for profit. The transaction took place on June 28, 1839. Delilah was taken from Belhaven in chains, loaded into a wagon with 6 other people, and transported toward Alabama. Eleanor watched from her window as the wagon departed. Jonathan was locked in his study, too drunk and too broken to even observe the final removal of the woman who destroyed him. The Merrick household began the process of rebuilding its reputation. But 12 days later, everything collapsed because on July 10, 1839, Jonathan Merrick's body was found in the Belhaven library. He'd cut his wrists with a razor and bled out over several hours. Beside him was a suicide note confessing to an affair with a house servant, expressing unbearable guilt and begging God's forgiveness for his sins. Eleanor found him in the morning, and her screams brought the entire household running. The scandal was immediate and catastrophic. Everything Eleanor had tried to prevent came flooding out. The affair became public knowledge. Jonathan's political career was posthumously destroyed. The Merrick family's reputation shattered. Their eldest son, Edward, returned from university to try managing affairs, but the damage was irreversible. Creditors who'd been patient suddenly demanded payment. Political allies distanced themselves. Social invitations stopped arriving. Within 6 months, Belhaven would be sold to cover debts, and the Merrick family would scatter to various relatives throughout the South, never to recover their former position. But the sheriff's investigation revealed something that troubled William Dye deeply. The suicide note was in Jonathan's handwriting, but something about it felt wrong. The phrasing was too controlled for a man in suicidal despair. The confessions were too specific, almost like someone had dictated what should be said. Daisy began investigating more carefully. He learned about the loan arrangement sending Delilah to Riverside. He discovered that she'd been in Savannah the week of Thornton's murder. He found servants willing to whisper about observing Delilah and Jonathan in private conversations that seemed inappropriate. A pattern emerged that pointed toward a possibility Daisy found almost unbelievable. that an enslaved woman had deliberately seduced Jonathan Merrick, used the affair to blackmail him, driven him to suicide, and somehow was also conic. Ted to Thomas Thornton's murder. Daisy sent word to authorities in Alabama to locate Josiah Puig's wagon and secure Delilah for questioning. But when Alabama law enforcement found in late July, they discovered something disturbing. Delilah had escaped 3 days into the journey. She'd somehow freed herself from her restraints during the night, disappeared into darkness, and vanished completely. Puig had filed reports, but hadn't pursued her aggressively. Losing one slave was a business expense he could absorb, and something about the woman had made him nervous. He was almost relieved she was gone. Daisy now had 2 murders, or 1 murder, and 1 suspicious suicide connected to a woman who disappeared. He issued notices throughout Georgia, Alabama, and South Carolina, describing Delilah and requesting her capture for questioning, but finding one woman among thousands of enslaved people moving through the South was nearly impossible, especially when that woman was intelligent, careful, and had spent years building networks that could hide her. The investigation stalled. Summer turned to fall, and Daisy began to think Delilah might never be found. He didn't know that she hadn't escaped at all, that her disappearance from Puig's wagon had been staged with the traitor's unwilling cooperation, that she'd paid him with information about other traitors' routes that was worth far more than her purchase price, and that she was currently living under a different name in Savannah, working as a free woman of color in a boarding house while she planned her next move. Because Delilah wasn't finished. She had 2 more families to destroy, and the chaos she'd already created would make her final acts easier to accomplish. In the world that exists here at the Sealed Room, we dig into the stories that others are afraid to tell, the ones that reveal uncomfortable truths about our history and the people who shaped it in ways no one expected. If you're captivated by what you're hearing, make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell. These hidden chapters of American history deserve to be remembered, and your support helps us keep bringing them to light. Now, let's discover how Delilah would finish what she started. Marcus Whitfield had been watching the destruction of the American Thornton families with growing unease. He knew Delilah was connected to both disasters, though he couldn't prove how. And he knew that his own arrangement with her, providing information about his family in exchange for her silence about his sexuality, made him complicit in whatever she was doing. In September 1839, he received a message delivered by a free black woman who worked in the Savannah market. The message was from Delilah. It said simply that she needed to meet with him, that she had a proposition that would benefit them both, and that if he didn't come alone to the specified location, certain letters he'd written to a man in Charleston would find their way to his father. Arcus went to the meeting because he had no choice. They met in a warehouse near the docks, empty at night, and far from anywhere he might be recognized. Delilah was waiting, dressed as a free woman, her bearing confident and unafraid. She spoke first. "I need you to help me with your father, and in exchange I will give you the freedom you've never had." He stared at her. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about destroying your father's hold over you, giving you enough money to leave Georgia and build a life somewhere you can be who you actually are. All you have to do is help me accomplish what I've been working toward for 2 years." Marcus sat heavily on a crate. "The Merricks and the Thorntons, that was you." She nodded. "They deserved what they received, and your father deserves the same. Why? What did any of them do to you?" She was quiet for a long moment. "They participated in a system that treats human beings as property. They used their power to abuse people who had no recourse, and they did it while considering themselves good Christian men. That's what they did. And that's why I've devoted myself to proving they're not as powerful or intelligent as they believe." Marcus understood then that he was talking to someone far more dangerous than he'd imagined. This wasn't about revenge for a personal wrong. This was ideological warfare. "But what do you need from me?" "Information about your father's business dealings, access to his study for 1 hour, and your cooperation in staging an incident that will destroy his credibility." "What kind of incident?" "The kind that will expose him as the hypocrite he is. Your father presents himself as a pillar of Christian virtue, "I intend to reveal otherwise." Marcus should have refused. He should have gone immediately to the sheriff and reported everything. But Delilah was offering him something he'd wanted his entire life. Escape from Georgia, from his father's control, from the constant fear of exposure. And so he agreed. Over the following weeks, Marcus provided Delilah with detailed information about Henry Whitfield's finances. He learned that his father had been secretly borrowing money at high interest to maintain the appearance of prosperity, that Oakmont was actually deeply in debt, that Henry had been embezzling from his own son's inheritance to cover losses. This information was valuable, but Delilah needed more. She needed evidence that would destroy Henry, not just financially, but morally. And Marcus, hating himself but unable to stop, gave her the key to finding it. In October 1839, Marcus arranged for his father to be called away from Oakmont on urgent business. While Henry was gone, Delilah entered the estate through a back entrance Marcus left unlocked. She went directly to Henry's private study and spent exactly 1 hour searching through locked drawers and hidden compartments. What she found exceeded her expectations. Henry Whitfield had been keeping a journal for over 20 years. In it he documented not just business affairs, but personal confessions that would destroy him, affairs with enslaved women that had produced children he'd sold away to avoid scandal, brutal punishments he'd inflicted on field workers for minor infractions, his role in helping other planters conceal crimes ranging from rape to murder. It was a confession of sins so comprehensive that Delilah almost couldn't believe he'd been foolish enough to write it down. But she understood the psychology. Powerful men often needed to document their power, even their crimes, as proof of their importance. She took the journal and replaced it with a different book of similar appearance. Unless Henry checked carefully, he wouldn't realize it was missing for some time. Then she left exactly as she'd entered, and Marcus locked the door behind her. The next phase required patience. Delilah spent weeks studying the journal, understanding Henry's vulnerabilities, and identifying the perfect way to use what she'd learned. In November, she arranged through intermediaries for copies of specific pages to be sent to different people. Pages documenting affairs were sent to the wives of planters Henry considered allies. Pages describing illegal business dealings went to his creditors. Pages confessing to his role in concealing a murder were sent to Sheriff Dye. Each recipient received just enough to understand Henry Whitfield was not the man he pretended to be. The reaction was slower than the immediate scandals that had consumed the Merricks and Thornton, but more comprehensive. Henry's wife, Constance, confronted him about the affairs, then left Oakmont and returned to her family in Virginia. His business associates began demanding immediate payment of debts, no longer willing to extend credit to someone whose journal revealed his contempt for them, and Daisy, reading confessions of criminal conspiracy, initiated a formal investigation. By December 1839, Henry Whitfield was besieged on all sides. His family was fracturing, his finances were collapsing, and he was facing potential criminal charges. Marcus watched his father's destruction with complicated feelings. Relief at finally being free of the man's control, guilt at his own role in the collapse, and growing fear about what Delilah would do next. Because he'd come to understand that she never stopped halfway, she completed what she started on December 23, 1839. Henry Whitfield's body was found in the Oakmont stable. He'd hanged himself from a roof beam. The suicide note was brief and angry, blaming his enemies for persecution, claiming his confessions had been taken out of context, insisting he'd been no worse than any other planter in Georgia. It was defiant rather than remorseful, exactly the kind of note Henry would write. But Daisy, examining the scene, found small details that troubled him. Scuff marks on the floor that suggested struggle, bruising on Henry's arms that seemed inconsistent with suicide, and most significantly, the rope had been tied with a specific knot that Henry, who'd never worked with ships or sailing, was unlikely to know. Daisy was now convinced he was dealing with a killer of extraordinary sophistication, someone who could make murders look like suicides or accidents, someone who understood human psychology well enough to forge notes that seemed genuine, someone who moved invisibly through society while orchestrating destruction, suspect had vanished, and when acknowledging her capabilities required admitting that an enslaved woman had outsmarted George's most powerful families, Daisy made a decision. He would find Delilah whatever it took, and when he did, he would ensure she faced justice, even if it required changing how justice worked. Sheriff William Dye's investigation entered a new phase in January 1840. He was no longer simply trying to solve murders. He was trying to capture someone who'd become almost mythical in his mind, a woman who could seduce powerful men, extract their secrets, drive them to destruction, and disappear without leaving evidence that would hold up in any court. He began approaching the case differently, focusing not on the crimes themselves, but on Delilah's patterns. Where did she go between families? How did she maintain her networks? Who helped her move through society? The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A free black seamstress named Ruth, who worked in Savannah, approached Daisy voluntarily in February. She was terrified, but Ute felt compelled to speak. Ruth had been helping Delilah by providing safe housing and false identity papers. She'd done it originally because Delilah had helped her sister escape from a brutal owner years earlier. But Ruth had come to fear the woman she was harboring. "She's not just seeking revenge," Ruth told Daisy quietly. "She's trying to prove something, that she's smarter than all of you, that your whole system is built on lies about who's intelligent and who's not, and she won't stop until she's made her point completely. How many more families does she intend to target?" Ruth's answer chilled him. She mentioned 4 families specifically: the Merricks, the Thornton, the Whitfields, and the Beaumonts. "She's finished with 3. Richard Beaumont is next." Daisy knew Beaumont, a charming young planter with European education and progressive views on modernizing agriculture. What vulnerability could Delilah possibly exploit there? Ruth's answer was devastating. "Mr. Beaumont has secrets that would destroy him if they became public. Secrets about his time in Europe, about why he really left France so suddenly, about what he did to a young woman in Paris that resulted in her death and his need to flee before authorities could charge him." Daisy realized immediately that if Delilah knew this information, she had Beaumont completely in her power. He sent deputies to Beaumont's estate immediately with orders to secure the property and question the household staff. But they arrived too late. Richard Beaumont had already made contact with Delilah, or more accurately, she'd made contact with him, because 3 days before Daisy learned about Beaumont being the final target, Delilah had walked directly up to Richard Beaumont at the Savannah Cotton Exchange and introduced herself using a false name. She was posing as a free woman of color seeking employment, and she'd made certain their meeting appeared completely accidental. Richard had been immediately attracted to her intelligence and bearing. When she mentioned she was seeking a position as a housekeeper, he'd offered employment at his estate almost immediately. His wife had died the previous year from fever, and he'd been managing the household through servants who lacked refinement. This woman seemed perfect for his needs. Delilah arrived at the Beaumont estate on February 12, 1840, as a hired employee rather than enslaved property. Richard had no idea who she really was, no connection between this refined free woman and the slave who destroyed 3 other families. She spent the first week simply observing and managing household affairs with impressive competence. Richard found himself drawn to conversations with her. She was educated, well-spoken, and unlike the provincial women he'd met since returning to Georgia. On February 20th, during a private conversation in his study, Delilah dropped her pretense. "Mr. Beaumont, I think we should be honest with each other about who we really are." He looked confused. "I don't understand what you mean. My name is not Martha Freeman. It's Delilah, and I know exactly what happened in Paris in 1835 with Gabrielle Marchand." The color drained from Richard's face. "That's impossible. No one in Georgia knows about that. I know about it because I make it my business to know everything about the men I target. And you, Mr. Beaumont, are my final target." Richard's hand moved toward a desk drawer where he kept a pistol. Delilah didn't move. "If you shoot me," she said calmly, "the evidence I've compiled about Paris will be delivered to authorities here and in France. If you try to have me arrested, the same evidence becomes public. Your only option is to cooperate with me. What do you want?" She smiled. "I want you to write a full confession of what you did in Paris, Every detail, how you seduced Gabrielle Marchand, how you got her pregnant, how you arranged for her to have an abortion that went wrong and killed her, how you bribed officials to avoid prosecution and fled to America. I want you to document all of it in your own handwriting." Richard was shaking. "Why? Why would I give you that kind of power over me? Because if you do, I might let you live. If you don't, I will destroy you slowly and publicly in ways that will make the American Whitfield scandals seem merciful by comparison." Over the next 3 days, Richard wrote the confession Delilah demanded, every shameful detail of what he'd done. As he wrote, Delilah explained her philosophy to him. "You sent everything wrong with the system we live in." She told him, "You're a man who committed a terrible crime, but faced no consequences because you had money and connections. You fled to America and rebuilt your reputation, while Gabrielle Marchand lies in an unmarked grave. And you live in a society where you can own human beings while considering yourself enlightened. That's what I'm fighting against, the fundamental corruption of a system that gives men like you power while denying it to people like me." When Richard finished writing, Delilah took the confession and read it carefully. Then she looked at him with something almost like pity. "You asked why I'm doing this. It's because I want to prove that intelligence and determination matter more than power or position, that a woman who society considers property can destroy men who consider themselves masters. I've taken down 3 families already. Yours will be the 4th and final. And when I'm finished, people throughout Georgia will know that it was a slave woman who did this, that all your assumptions about superiority were lies." Richard made his decision in that moment. He lunged at Delilah with a letter opener, intending to kill her before she could leave with his confession. But Delilah had anticipated exactly this response. She'd positioned herself near the door and had loosened the carpet in a way that would cause him to stumble. When Richard charged, he caught his foot on the loosened carpet and fell forward. The letter opener went into his own chest as he landed. The wound wasn't immediately fatal, but it was serious. Delilah watched him bleed on his study floor, making no move to help. Richard gasped for air, staring at her with hatred and disbelief. "You plan this every moment?" She nodded. "I plan everything, Mr. Beaumont. That's the difference between us. You act on impulse and emotion. I act with calculation and purpose." He died within minutes, and Delilah calmly arranged the scene to look like suicide. She placed the confession on his desk where it would be found. She positioned the body to suggest he'd taken his own life after writing out his guilt, and then she left exactly as she'd arrived, walking out the front door like any employee, ending their day's work. She was 3 miles from the estate when Daisy's deputies arrived. They found Richard Beaumont's body and his confession, which detailed crimes committed in France, but said nothing about Delilah or events in Georgia. The death was ruled suicide by a man consumed with guilt over past actions. But Daisy, when he examined the scene later that day, knew immediately it was murder. He'd learned enough about Delilah's methods to recognize her work. The careful staging, the psychological manipulation leading to a death that looked self-inflicted. The confession that explained motive while concealing the real story. DA issued new warrants for Delilah's arrest, this time specifying 4 counts of murder. He offered substantial reward, DS, for information leading to her capture. And he sent notices to law enforcement throughout the South describing her and warning that she was exceptionally dangerous. But Delilah had vanished again. She'd left Savannah hours after Beaumont's death, traveling with false papers that identified her as a free woman heading to Charleston. From Charleston, the trail went cold. Some reports placed her in North Carolina. Others suggested she'd gone west toward Tennessee. A few claimed she'd boarded a ship heading north to free states. The truth was that Delilah had done something none of them expected. She'd returned to the one place no one would think to look. She'd gone back to Belhaven, the Mirror estate that had been sold after Jonathan's death. The new owner was a businessman from Charleston who'd purchased the property at a significant discount due to its scandal-tainted history. He was attempting to restore the estate's reputation and needed experienced household staff. Delilah, using another false identity, presented herself as a free woman with references from several families, references she'd forged with the same meticulous care she brought to everything. She was hired immediately and began working at the very estate where her campaign of destruction had begun 3 years earlier. It was a calculated risk, but Delilah understood human psychology. People would search for her everywhere except the places she'd already been. They would assume she'd fled far from Georgia, not returned to the scene of her earliest triumph. She lived and worked at Belhaven for 6 months, managing the household efficiently while maintaining her false identity. She listened to gossip about the murders and disappearance. She heard theories about where Delilah had gone and what her true motivations had been, and she waited patiently for the right moment to complete her plan. Because Delilah's ultimate goal wasn't just destroying 4 families, it was ensuring that her story would be known and understood, that history would remember what she'd done and why. In August 1840, she approached a Savannah newspaper editor named Thomas Whitmore through an intermediary. She offered him an exclusive account of the murders that had terrified Georgia's planter class for 2 years. The real story told from the perspective of the woman who'd orchestrated everything. Whitmore was skeptical initially, but the intermediary provided details that could only have come from someone intimately involved. Specific information about the Merrick affair that had never been made public. Exact descriptions of evidence from the Whitfield case that only the killer would know. Whitmore agreed to meet with the source with guarantees of anonymity and safety during the interview. The meeting took place in September 1840 in a private room at a boarding house in Savannah. Delilah arrived wearing a veil and speaking in careful, measured tones. She spent 4 hours telling Whitmore everything: her background as a free black woman illegally enslaved, her years of planning and observation, her methods for seducing powerful men and extracting their secrets, the specific steps she'd taken to destroy each family, and her philosophical justification for actions that had resulted in 4 deaths and multiple ruined families. Whitmore filled dozens of pages with notes, occasionally asking questions, but mostly just listening and growing astonishment. When she finished, he had one question. "Why are you telling me this now? Why risk exposure?" "Because why risk exposure?" "Because I want people to know the truth," she answered. "I want the historical record to show that an enslaved woman outsmarted Georgia's most powerful families, that all your society's assumptions about intelligence and capability based on race and status are lies. I want future generations to understand that slavery contained within it the seeds of its own destruction, because you cannot keep intelligent people in bondage and expect them not to use their intelligence against you." What happened next would become one of the most controversial publishing decisions in Georgia history. Whitmore wrote a series of articles based on Delilah's confession. He titled them "The Confessions of a Murderess: How One Woman Destroyed Georgia's Elite." The articles detailed everything she'd told him, presenting her actions not as random violence, but as calculated warfare against the institution of slavery. The Savannah Morning Chronicle published his first article on October 1, 1840. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Some readers insisted the articles must be fabrication, that no slave woman could have done what was described. Others demanded Whitmore reveal his source location so she could be captured and executed. A few radical abolitionists in the North reprinted the articles, holding Delilah up as an example of justified resistance against oppression. The debate became national, forcing conversations about slavery, intelligence, and power that made many people deeply uncomfortable. Sheriff Dye read the articles with frustration bordering on despair. Everything Delilah had described matched his investigation perfectly, but she'd revealed nothing about her current location, and Whitmore refused to cooperate with law enforcement, citing journalistic principles about protecting sources. Daisy was now chasing a woman who'd become a symbol. To some, she was a murderer who deserved hanging. To others, she was a revolutionary fighting a war against unjust oppression. The search continued for months. Daisy retired in 1842 without ever capturing Delilah. His successor continued the investigation, but with decreasing intensity as years passed and new crimes demanded attention. The case remained technically open, but most people assumed Delilah had either died or successfully escaped to free territories in the North. The truth about what happened to Delilah after the articles were published has never been definitively established. Some historians believe she continued working at Belhaven under her false identity, living out her life in plain sight at the scene of her first victory. Others think she used the chaos created by the articles to flee Georgia entirely, possibly reaching Canada or even Europe. A few pieces of evidence suggest intriguing possibilities. In 1843, a woman matching Delilah's description was reported living in Philadelphia, working as a paid lecturer for abolitionist societies and telling audiences about her experiences. In 1847, someone using one of Delilah's known false names purchased passage on a ship to Liberia, and in 1851, a memoir was published anonymously in London titled Confessions of a Georgia Slave, containing details that closely match the newspaper articles, but with additional philosophical reflections on slavery, power, and resistance. Whether any of these women were actually Delilah, or whether she met a different fate entirely remains unknown. What is certain is the legacy she left behind. The 4 families she targeted never recovered their former positions. The Merrick children scattered throughout the South, never achieving the prominence their father had sought. Abigail Thornton remarried but lived quietly, never speaking publicly about her husband's death. Marcus Whitfield used money he'd hidden from his father's estate to move to California in 1849, where he lived under an assumed name and was never connected to the Georgia scandals. The Beaumont estate was sold to cover Richard's debts, and his crimes in Paris were eventually prosecuted posthumously by French authorities seeking symbolic justice for Gabrielle Marron. But beyond individual family destruction, Delilah's actions had broader impact on Georgia society. Planters became more cautious about which enslaved people they brought into intimate household positions. There was increased paranoia about servants. Gathering information and maintaining communication networks